My son tried to erase me from Christmas, but what he really did was try to erase me from my own life. 75 years. That's a long time to live, and an even longer time to watch the seasons turn, the leaves fall, and the people you love grow up and then grow away. After all those decades, raising 4 children and burying my Edward 5 years ago, I truly believed I had seen every shade of human betrayal. I was wrong. My name is Vivian Sterling. For 50 years, this house in Greenwich, Connecticut, was my sanctuary. Edward and I built it brick by brick with the hard work of his medical practice and my senior accounting career. It's more than $5 million in real estate. It's the physical proof of our entire lives, our legacy. I thought my role as the matriarch was secure, set in stone, especially after all the Christmases I hosted in that very living room. The joyful chaos, the mountains of wrapping paper, the smell of pine and nutmeg. That was my dream, and for decades, I lived it. Then came October, and the betrayal was delivered not in a shouting match, but in a cold corporate group text from my eldest son, Ethan, and his wife, Olivia. No loving call, no gentle discussion. Just a notification announcing the Christmas schedule. They explained that because of space logistics and the stress of transport for me, the gathering would be at their house this year. The message ended with an empty little heart emoji. That was the moment I realized they weren't trying to make things easier for me. They were trying to remove me from the center of my own family. They were trying to make me a burden, an afterthought, a piece that simply didn't fit into their new, perfectly curated family portrait. They thought my age made me pliable, forgetful, or too frail to fight back. They couldn't have been more wrong. They forgot that the hands that changed their diapers and cooked thousands of meals were also the hands that managed the finances of a major firm and kept meticulous records. I have lived long enough to know that sometimes you have to fight the hardest for your dignity. They were playing a short game of greed. I was playing a long game of justice. And I was just getting started. So, if you want to know how an old woman used 7 decades of collected wisdom to expose a greedy scheme and save her own legacy, settle in. This is the story of the Christmas they tried to cancel me, and how I turned the tables on them, right in the middle of my own living room. If you're ready to hear the truth, please subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss a single chapter of my story. The moment I read Olivia's little text, that cold, logistical text about Christmas, a lifetime of memories turned to ash in my mouth. Edward used to joke that I could smell a lie across a crowded room, a skill honed by 50 years of marriage and a long career in accounting where the numbers always had to tell the truth, even if people didn't. My first instinct, the one that comes from the gut, told me this wasn't about the stress of transport or logistics. This was about control. I went to my old friend, Eleanor, for the kind of tough love only another 80-year-old widow who had been there could give. Eleanor lives down in Florida now, but we were neighborhood wives for 30 years, and she had seen her own children try to gently shunt her aside after her husband passed. When I explained the text, she didn't mince words. She told me that young people think the difference between caring for and isolating an elderly parent is a blurry line, but to us, it's a chasm. She reminded me that Ethan and Olivia's house is barely half the size of mine. This wasn't about space. It was about establishing their territory, claiming the role of the new family hub, and slowly, gently moving the old furniture, that's me, out of the picture so the inheritance could follow smoothly. That conversation was the first crack in the facade. It wasn't just a snub, it was a strategy. I began to watch them, Ethan and Olivia, with the sharp eyes of a senior auditor looking for a discrepancy in the books. I kept a ledger of their movements, not in a physical book anymore, but in my mind, which, despite their subtle implications, was still razor sharp. The little things started adding up. A few weeks after the Christmas text, my daughter-in-law, Olivia, had the audacity to call me, and explained that she was simplifying things by having all major family communications, including certain financial mailers, sent directly to their address. She said it was so they could filter out the junk for me and make sure I didn't get overwhelmed. I remember her voice being sickly sweet, like cheap holiday candy. When I asked her why my bank statements needed filtering, she just chuckled and said that I was getting a little confused with all the paperwork these days. Confused. That word was their favorite weapon. Then came the incident with my old friend Betsy. Betsy and I have been bridge partners for decades. I hadn't heard from her in weeks, and I started to worry. When I finally called her on my landline, she sounded genuinely shocked to hear my voice. She told me she had called me 3 times, but that Olivia had answered and told her, "Vivian is having a quiet day and really shouldn't be disturbed." Betsy said that Olivia had gone on to mention very casually that I was beginning to struggle with social activities and really should limit outside contact. My own friend, the one who knows I can run rings around 320-somethings at a bridge table, thought I was becoming a recluse because of what my own daughter-in-law had manufactured. It wasn't just one lie. It was a calculated pattern of gentle, insidious isolation. They were carefully, brick by subtle brick, building a narrative that I was becoming senile, mentally incapable, or too fragile to manage my own life. They needed that story to be true so that when it came time to discuss the house, the money, and Edward's legacy, no one would question their right to step in as my caretakers and decision-makers. They were underestimating the power of an old woman with nothing but time, a long memory, and a lifetime of perfect record-keeping. They had all their plans on their phone, their modern ways. What they didn't know is that the master files, the paper trail that held the truth, were locked up tight in my safe deposit box. Documents Edward and I had accumulated over 40 years with the help of our lawyer, Arthur Peterson. The real story, the one that exposed their greed, wasn't on a phone screen. It was printed on thick, acid-free paper, tucked away for safekeeping. I felt a cold shiver, but it wasn't fear. It was the clarity of absolute certainty. The fight wasn't about Christmas dinner anymore. It was about my dignity and the legacy Edward and I had built. I looked out at the familiar 50-year-old oak tree in my front yard, the one that had witnessed 4 generations of family life. It was a beautiful, sturdy sentinel, shedding its last autumn leaves. And in that moment, I knew I was just like that tree. They could try to strip me down, but they couldn't uproot me. I picked up the phone. I didn't call Ethan or Olivia. I called Arthur Peterson, Edward's lawyer. I needed to know exactly what legal safeguards I had and exactly what kind of trouble they were trying to create. I needed a clear picture of the battlefield. My son had looked me in the eye and, through his wife's thinly veiled messages, told me I was irrelevant. But when I hung up the phone with Arthur, I had my answer. It wasn't paranoia. They were absolutely, undeniably after the house, and they were using my age as the weapon to steal it. Arthur Peterson is a man of the old guard, just like Edward. He's nearing retirement himself. With a desk piled high with 50 years of paper, a true comfort to a woman like me who trusts ink on parchment more than glowing screens. When I called him, I didn't beat around the bush. I simply told him I was worried my eldest son and his wife were confusing care with control, and that I needed a full briefing on the Sterling family trust. Arthur didn't sound surprised. He told me, very gently, that these things happen all the time, especially with families seeing a parent's assets, like this magnificent house, as their immediate future. He explained the legal architecture Edward and I had set up decades ago, an ironclad trust designed to protect me, Vivian, first and foremost, ensuring I could live here until my last day, with the principal passing to my 4 children only upon my death. The structure was sound, but Arthur warned me that the most common attack, the easiest path for predators, was to question my capacity. That word, capacity, felt like a cold stone settling in my stomach. It was the legal equivalent of their favorite word, confused. My investigation became an obsession. I knew they were building a case against my mental state, so I decided to use the very things that make me old, my thoroughness, my love of history, and my physical archives, to expose their moves. I pulled out my old steel filing cabinet, the one Edward called the Vivian Vault, tucked away in the back of the linen closet. It contained everything: canceled checks from 1978, every tax return, the children's birth certificates, and every piece of official family correspondence for 40 years. I wasn't looking for proof of their greed. I already knew that was the motive. I was looking for proof of their method. The first piece of concrete evidence wasn't a document, but a pattern in my mail. I realized Olivia wasn't just filtering my mail, she was redirecting it. I noticed for months, things like the monthly statements from the investment firm and the annual property tax bill simply stopped arriving. When I checked with the town assessor's office, they told me they had received a formal address change request, signed, they said, by Vivian Sterling's power of attorney, Olivia Sterling. I never gave her power of attorney, never signed a paper. I felt a dizzying wave of coldness wash over me. I called the investment firm next. The representative told me that Ethan had called them 6 months ago, claiming that I was having trouble reading the small print and requested that all important financial communications be sent to his address, where he could review and explain them to me. When I asked the representative why he agreed to this without my explicit written consent, he just repeated that Ethan had assured them I was getting a little forgetful. They were isolating me financially, not just socially. They were creating a paper trail that showed I was too frail to manage my own affairs, paving the way for a guardianship filing, which, of course, they intended to be the guardians of my assets. The sheer depth of the scheme made my hands tremble. This wasn't a sudden burst of greed. It was an orchestrated long-term campaign. The realization hit me. They hadn't just started this in October with the Christmas text. They had been working on this quietly for months, maybe since Edward died, the text message only being the final confirmation that they felt they had successfully marginalized me. But the most painful discovery involved my granddaughter, Chloe. My sweet Chloe was my bright spot, my most precious link to the future. I knew she was confused by the Christmas move, but she never let on how deep the manipulation ran until I called her directly, off the family group chat, on her college line. She was sobbing when she told me that Ethan and Olivia had specifically instructed her not to invite me to her upcoming college graduation the following spring. They told her I would be too agitated by the travel and that I should just watch the video later. My granddaughter, who I love more than life itself, was being forced to push me away. They were successfully orchestrating my total social isolation, using the excuse of my comfort to achieve their financial goals. I hung up the phone with Chloe, and the pain, that agonizing, sharp pain of knowing your own flesh and blood would discard you for money, almost buckled my knees. I walked through the living room, the one where Edward and I had danced countless times and raised our family, and I realized they didn't see it as a home. They saw it as a number in a bank account. I straightened my back. My tears stopped immediately. That moment was the turning point. I had allowed them to wound me deeply because I saw them as my children. From that day forward, I would see them as adversaries. They had misjudged the decades I spent running boardrooms, not just households. They thought I was a helpless old woman, a sweet, confused relic who would just sit down and wait for the end. They were about to learn that age brings a wisdom that can cut deeper than any lawyer's brief. The moment I accepted them as adversaries, the game changed. I had the facts, attempted redirection of finances, orchestrated social isolation, and the establishment of a false narrative about my mental capacity. Now I needed to gather my resources and turn their primary weapon, my supposed frailty, into my greatest defense. I started playing the role they had written for me. When Ethan called a week later, it was a perfunctory, 5-minute check-in call that felt more like ticking a box. I leaned into the performance. I spoke softly, slowly, and a little vaguely. He asked how I was, and I told him I was feeling very tired, that I was having trouble with the little things, and that I was so grateful that he and Olivia were handling the complexities of the holiday. He jumped on it. He told me he understood completely, that I just needed to rest, and that his main concern was my well-being. He was practically preening on the phone, thinking I was confirming his narrative. He said that he and Olivia would come by next Tuesday to go over some paperwork to make sure all my accounts were easy to manage. He emphasized the word easy. I simply sighed dramatically and agreed, telling him that my head was just not what it used to be. It was an acting performance worthy of an Oscar, and it was crucial. I was lulling them into a false sense of security, reinforcing the very stereotype they were using to isolate me. The following Tuesday, they arrived, full of that synthetic warmth that chills you to the bone. Olivia was carrying a folder labeled Vivian Sterling, Administrative, and she had a patronizing smile glued to her face. They sat me down at the dining table, my table, where I had hosted Thanksgiving for 50 years, and began their presentation. Ethan started by talking about the house, this beloved place. He told me that keeping up with the maintenance was a burden for a woman my age, and that the property taxes were astronomical. He then suggested they could take over the mortgage payments and assume the principal ownership now, saying it would free up my cash flow and give them peace of mind. He kept assuring me I could live here until the end of my days, but the subtext was loud and clear. Sign the house over now. I played the confused victim perfectly. I furrowed my brow, put a shaky hand to my head, and told them I couldn't quite remember the details of the original trust. I said I thought Edward had set things up so that only my lawyer, Arthur Peterson, could ever change the principal beneficiaries, but I was probably just confused. Olivia laughed, a short, sharp sound that was anything but kind. She patted my hand like I was a toddler and said that lawyers made things sound too complicated and that really, she had the latest version of everything. She had the nerve to say that the official documents I might remember seeing with Arthur were old news and that Edward had actually set up a very simple, direct transfer upon my incapacitation. That was the crucial, arrogant slip. She was confirming that they were anticipating, even planning for, my incapacitation. Then she made her biggest mistake. Thinking I was too vague to understand or remember, Olivia opened her folder. She pulled out a printed sheet and, leaning close to Ethan, whispered that the biggest issue was that I still had control of the primary account, the one that paid the household bills, and that they needed me to sign an electronic fund transfer authorization for a new joint account, which she called the Household Expense Management Account. She told Ethan, loud enough for me to hear but still thinking she was speaking confidentially, that this was the last step before they could lock down the majority of the funds. I saw the form. I saw the bank name. I saw the line where I was supposed to sign my independent financial control away. I put on my best bewildered look. I reached for the pen, and then, instead of signing, I intentionally fumbled it. It rolled off the table with a clatter. As Ethan bent down to retrieve it, I looked directly at Olivia, my eyes wide and innocent, and I said, "You know, dear, I'm just so bad with technology these days. Why don't you just leave that here with me? I'll call Arthur Peterson in the morning and ask him to explain this transfer thing to me. He always draws little diagrams that make sense to my old brain." The blood drained from Olivia's face. She recovered quickly, forcing a smile, but the surprise and the fear were raw and exposed. She realized her mistake. She had revealed the entire scope of their financial plan, believing I was too far gone to ask the right questions. She claimed that calling Arthur was too much fuss and that she could explain it, but I held firm. I was too tired and too confused to sign anything without my lawyer's explanation. They left soon after, their synthetic calm shattered. They had come to get my signature and left empty-handed. But I hadn't left empty-handed either. I had the name of the bank and the name of that new management account. More importantly, I had confirmation that they thought I was simple enough to be manipulated, and that subtly subestimating my old brain was the biggest, most fatal mistake they had ever made. The moment the door closed behind Ethan and Olivia, the tired and confused mask came off. I wasn't just relieved, I was furious. But fury at my age is a cold, calculated thing. It's not the fire of youth. It's the slow, steady burn of 1,000 memories being defiled. I immediately called Arthur Peterson. I gave him the details, the name of the household expense management account, and Olivia's careless admission that my primary account was the only thing preventing them from locking down the majority of the funds. Arthur confirmed my worst suspicions. They were employing a classic financial elder abuse tactic, using a joint account transfer to gain access to the principal under the guise of easier management. But Arthur brought a deeper layer to the betrayal. He told me that 6 months ago, shortly after Edward's 5-year memorial, Ethan had called him. Ethan had claimed, very matter-of-factly, that I was expressing a desire to downsize and sell the Greenwich property. Arthur said he found this strange, knowing how much the house meant to me. He then told me that Ethan had asked Arthur to draw up a preemptive sales agreement, suggesting they list the house at a price Arthur considered laughably low, at least $300, $1,000 below market value. I sank into my chair. It wasn't just about waiting for the inheritance. It was about impatience. They didn't want to wait for me to pass away naturally. They saw the house as dead money, a massive asset that was stagnating while I lived out my remaining years comfortably. They saw the value of Edward's legacy only in how quickly they could liquidate it and use the cash for their own comfort, likely to upgrade their smaller house, the very one they were using as the new, convenient Christmas venue. Arthur confirmed that Ethan had even used the phrase, "She doesn't really need that much cash flow anymore, Arthur. We can manage the rest for her." They wanted the money, and they wanted it now, before the property taxes increased again, before the housing market potentially shifted, and certainly before any of my other children realized the full scope of what was happening. That's when I understood the true, cold motivation, disrespect for the generation that built the wealth. To Ethan and Olivia, I wasn't their mother or mother-in-law. I was a ticking clock. My life, my memories, and my attachment to the legacy were inconvenient obstacles in their quick grab for cash. The logistics of Christmas, the confused memory, the exclusion from Chloe's graduation, it all funneled back to this one central, terrible truth. They were rushing to clear the field so they could cash in the sterling name. I thought back to my younger children. My other 3 children were scattered, living quieter lives and less financially dependent on the eventual inheritance. They were all busy, but they still called, still sent cards, still made sure I felt loved, without the suffocating help that reeked of ulterior motives. Ethan, the eldest, the one who was supposed to be the pillar after Edward was gone, was the one dismantling everything. I realized I couldn't just stop their scheme. I had to expose the motive. The family needed to see the ugliness beneath the perfect suburban veneer. I instructed Arthur to do 2 things immediately. First, to send a formal, notarized letter to the investment firm and the town assessor's office, explicitly revoking any implied or stated power of attorney held by Olivia or Ethan, and demanding a full reversal of all mail redirection. Second, I told him to pull the original, signed 50-year-old deed of trust for the Greenwich property. Arthur asked why I needed that old document. I told him I needed to remind everyone, especially Ethan, of the exact wording Edward and I had used when we set up the ironclad conditions of the trust. Conditions that only a woman with decades of experience would remember were designed to protect the very principle they were trying to steal. I hung up, looking at the faded spot on the dining table where Olivia's paperwork had been. They wanted quick cash and control. I was about to show them that some legacies aren't just bought and sold. They are earned, and they are fiercely protected by the one who earned them. They wanted a swift transaction. I was preparing for a public trial. With the motive exposed, impatience and raw greed, my energy wasn't exhausted. It was sharpened. A 75-year-old woman has limited strength, but I learned long ago that the power of a woman isn't in her muscles. It's in the depth of her files and the loyalty of her allies. My crucial resource wasn't the house itself or even the money, but the paper trail that proved my dignity and their deceit. The first physical step was recovering the original deed of trust. Arthur sent his junior paralegal, a respectful young woman named Sarah, to my house with the document, sealed in a heavy manila envelope and a set of instructions. When Sarah arrived, I had her sit with me in the library, a room Ethan and Olivia always treated like a museum piece, too dusty for their modern sensibilities. I broke the seal and spread the massive, crinkled pages across the mahogany table. This deed wasn't just a legal document. It was a testament to Edward's foresight and my own meticulous nature. It detailed the creation of the Sterling Family Trust, ensuring that the primary asset, the Greenwich property, was fully protected, but the most decisive clause was tucked deep inside, a clause Ethan and Olivia probably never even read in their rush to find the fast track to ownership. It was a stipulation of moral conduct. Edward, being the honorable man he was, insisted that the beneficiaries of the primary trust not only be direct descendants, but also adhere to standards of conduct, particularly regarding the welfare and respect of the surviving spouse. That's me. The document stated that any attempt by a beneficiary to undermine the capacity, isolate, or financially exploit the surviving spouse could be interpreted as a breach of the trust's fiduciary duty to the legacy. And the punishment was severe. The surviving spouse, again me, had the explicit, non-delegable right to redraft the distribution schedule for the primary asset upon presentation of evidence of said breach. This was the ultimate safeguard, the one they missed. Edward and I had made sure that the house was protected not just from creditors, but from greedy children. I knew the evidence I had collected, the mail redirection forms, Olivia's admission of locking down the funds, and Chloe's heartbroken call about the graduation was more than enough to satisfy the attempted isolation and undermining of capacity clause. The next decisive resource I needed was an ally, someone from their own world who was outside their circle of immediate control. That person was my granddaughter, Chloe. I knew I had to handle this delicately. I didn't want to drag her into the mess, but I needed her testimony to solidify the emotional breach of the trust. I called her back, and this time I didn't let her cry. I spoke to her not as her grandmother, but as a seasoned woman explaining a very complicated business problem. I told her the truth about the house, the trust, and their attempt to sell it. I explained that her parents were trying to prevent her from attending her own graduation and that I was fighting to change that. I told her I only needed one thing, a written statement confirming that her parents explicitly forbade her from inviting me to the graduation, claiming it was for my agitation. I told her that I was fighting for my dignity, but also for her right to choose who celebrated her achievements. She didn't hesitate. She immediately confirmed everything, saying her parents had also told her to stop calling me so often because I was becoming dependent. Chloe wrote a precise, honest account of her parents' instructions and emailed it to Arthur Peterson. Now, I had the legal mechanism, the moral clause in the original trust, and the crucial emotional evidence, the betrayal of my granddaughter. They thought I was alone, relying on outdated technology. They didn't realize that the deepest bond in the family, the one between a grandmother and her favorite granddaughter, was the one I had secured. And it was the one piece of evidence they could never explain away. With the original deed of trust in Arthur's possession and Chloe's statement secured, the preparation phase was complete. I was armed with paper and truth, which, in a legal battle, is far more powerful than money. My focus shifted from gathering evidence to selecting the battleground and the exact moment for the strike. Ethan and Olivia were still operating under the assumption that they had me cornered. They thought I was a weary old bird, too timid to make a scene and too confused to take action. They had even left the country for a short, luxurious, pre-holiday trip to the Caribbean, a trip I suspected was financed by dipping into what they considered their future funds. They were enjoying their arrogance, certain that when they returned, I would be ready to sign their household management paperwork. That Caribbean trip was the key. It created the perfect window of vulnerability, removing them from the scene while I prepared the grand unveiling. I knew the confrontation couldn't be a private affair. That would only result in denial and further gaslighting, with them claiming I was simply confused about the conversation. This needed to be public, undeniable, and in a setting that maximized their shame and my recovered authority. The solution came to me, simple and elegant, while I was polishing Edward's old silver, the silver we used only for the grandest occasions. I would invite the entire extended family to my house for a special holiday gathering. I instructed Arthur Peterson to send out a formal printed invitation, none of their casual group texts. This invitation went to all 4 of my children and their spouses, all 7 of my grandchildren, my 2 surviving sisters and their families, Edward's retired medical partners, and our closest lifelong friends from the bridge and garden clubs. 50 people in all. The invitation was titled, Vivian Sterling's Annual Holiday Dinner and Legacy Announcement. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Everyone loved coming to the big house, and the promise of a legacy announcement was a powerful draw, a respectful way of saying I was addressing Edward's and my long-term plans. I started preparing the house. I had the antique mahogany table polished. I ordered a spectacular 20-foot Christmas tree, the kind that scrapes the high ceiling of the foyer, just like Edward always insisted. I hired caterers, discreet, professional services who didn't ask questions, and had them set up the menu. All the classic, time-consuming dishes that Ethan and Olivia had complained were too much fuss for their convenient gatherings. I wanted the house to not just look like a celebration, but to smell and sound like the life they were trying to steal. The date was set for the first Saturday in December, the weekend before Ethan and Olivia were scheduled to return from their tropical vacation. It was the perfect moment. They would be abroad, convinced I was sitting quietly at home, waiting for their return. I realized that my age was no longer a burden. It was a cloak. They had seen me as a frail, confused old woman. They had seen the house as their inheritance. They had seen my legacy as their immediate cash flow. They completely failed to see that a woman who has endured 75 years of life, loss, and raising a family has developed a strategic patience that far outweighs their youthful arrogance. They were so focused on securing their future wealth that they forgot to check their mother's current power. I walked through the house that Friday night, the night before the party, seeing the chandeliers sparkle and the fireplace casting a warm glow. I was calm, collected, and absolutely ready. I knew that tomorrow, the house would be full of laughter, warmth, and the family spirit they had tried to exclude. Tomorrow, they would learn that age brings wisdom, not weakness. Tomorrow, they would walk into a party where they were the only ones who didn't know the guest of honor was hosting their public undoing. The first Saturday in December arrived, a crisp, cold Connecticut day that was the perfect contrast to the tropical sun Ethan and Olivia were enjoying. By 6 o'clock, the house was alive. 50 people, my other 3 children, their spouses, my grandchildren, my sisters, and our oldest, dearest friends, filled the rooms. The sound of real, unrestrained family laughter, the clinking of Edward's silver, and the smell of roasting ham and spices filled every corner. It was the Christmas celebration they tried to cancel, happening without them, and it felt magnificent. The evening was perfect, a flood of genuine warmth that reaffirmed everything Edward and I had built. Everyone kept remarking on how wonderfully sharp and energetic I looked, which, of course, was exactly what I needed them to see. I made a point of talking to everyone, especially my other children, making sure they knew I was present and engaged. I knew the scene was being documented in photos and videos, digital proof of my vitality. Ethan and Olivia were due back from their trip late Sunday night. They had planned to relax for a day, then call me Monday morning, ready to resume their manipulation. But my announcement couldn't wait. At the hour of dessert, I tapped the rim of my glass with a spoon. The noise and chatter slowly faded until a respectful, expectant silence fell over the dining room. I stood at the head of the table, looking out over the faces of my family and friends, some of whom had known me since I was a young bride. I started softly, telling them how much this house, this legacy, meant to me, and how much I valued the tradition of family gatherings. Then I let the mask drop completely. I looked directly at the empty chairs reserved at the table for Ethan and Olivia. I spoke clearly, without a tremor in my voice. I explained that I had received a text message earlier this fall, a cold, clinical note saying that because I was a burden and that the logistics of my presence were too stressful, the central family Christmas gathering was being moved away from my home. The silence that followed was shocking, a heavy, disbelieving weight. I heard a sharp intake of breath from one of my sisters. I continued, my voice steady. I said that living 75 years teaches you the difference between kindness and control. I told them that the exclusion wasn't just a slight, it was part of a months-long campaign of isolation. I revealed that my daughter-in-law had been redirecting my official mail and financial statements, and that my son had been telling friends and business contacts that I was too confused and forgetful to manage my own affairs, paving the way to steal the house and my independence. Then came the climax. I stated that the final, cruelest act was instructing their own daughter, my beloved granddaughter Chloe, not to invite me to her college graduation, using my fragility as an excuse. At that moment, my granddaughter Chloe, sitting near me, stood up. She didn't speak. She just put her arm around my shoulder and squeezed me tight, a silent, powerful confirmation of the truth. I told the room that this house, this legacy, was not a prize to be stolen by the impatient, and that Edward and I had foreseen such greed. I announced that the legacy announcement was not just a dinner, but a necessary official meeting. I gestured to the doorway where Arthur Peterson, who had been discreetly waiting, walked into the room carrying a briefcase. Because of these documented and witnessed attempts at emotional abuse and financial exploitation, I declared, I have exercised a right stipulated in the original, ironclad Sterling Family Trust. Arthur stepped forward and, in his official legal voice, began to read the operative clause, the stipulation of moral conduct, and the final revisions to the trust. He announced that due to the proven breach of the fiduciary duty to the surviving spouse, the principal trust controlling the house and the majority of my liquid assets, totaling over $2 million, had been significantly reallocated. A substantial portion was being moved to a new foundation, managed by my other 3 children and dedicated to preserving the memory of Dr. Edward Sterling. My 3 other children received a greater distribution of the remaining assets. Ethan and Olivia received a nominal, heavily monitored sum, strictly segregated from the principal. The room erupted not in shouting, but in a chaotic, stunned silence. Faces were pale, eyes wide. My 3 other children looked confused, then horrified, then finally, in that silence, supportive. The shock was absolute. I had not just told them the truth, I had legally, publicly, and irreversibly acted upon it. The silence in the room was not the end of the drama, but the beginning of the shockwave. They thought they had quietly excluded me from Christmas. I had just publicly excluded them from the Sterling legacy. The silence that followed Arthur's reading of the revised trust was a physical thing, thick and heavy, like the fog rolling in off the sound. It didn't break. It shattered. My other 3 children, stunned by the formal declaration, approached me, their faces a mix of shock and support. They told me they had suspected something was wrong, that Ethan and Olivia had been unusually cagey, but they never dreamed of the depth of the betrayal or the elegance of my counter-move. My sisters and lifelong friends, the ones who knew Edward and me best, surrounded me with fierce protective love. They told me that what I had done was a testament to the strength and integrity Edward always saw in me. They reminded me that I had faced down boardrooms of powerful men for years, a spoiled, greedy son and his wife, were no match for Vivian Sterling. The party continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The festive celebration transformed into a quiet, dignified show of support. When everyone had left and the house was silent again, the full weight of what I had done finally settled over me. It wasn't a victory dance. It was a profound sadness for the loss of a son I thought I knew. Ethan and Olivia arrived home late the next evening, jet-lagged and tanned from the Caribbean, completely unaware of the public storm waiting for them. They found out not from me, but from their own ringing phones. As soon as Arthur's office began circulating the official documents, as is legally required, the community grapevine, particularly the social circles they cherished, caught fire. My other children called Ethan first, demanding an explanation. I didn't hear the specifics of the conversation, but I heard the furious, panicked voices echoing through the walls. Later, my daughter-in-law, Olivia, had the audacity to storm over to the house the next morning, her tan practically vibrating with rage. She hammered on the door, shouting demands for me to explain myself and reverse the legal error. I refused to open the door. I simply stood in the middle of my foyer, the one she wanted to claim, and listened as she told my housekeeper, who was fiercely loyal to me, that I was clearly mentally unstable and that they would be contesting the entire thing. She was so focused on the money that she didn't realize the moral high ground was gone. She didn't realize that in our community, reputation is more valuable than net worth. By publicly exposing her isolation tactics, I had not only protected my assets, but I had delivered a mortal blow to their carefully constructed social standing. Ethan, too, finally called. He was cold, angry, and utterly devoid of remorse. He told me that I had ruined his life, that I had favored his siblings, and that I was punishing him for trying to look out for my best interests. He never once apologized for the text message, the mail redirection, or the exclusion of my own granddaughter. He just kept claiming I was confused and had been manipulated by my other children and Arthur. When he ran out of accusations, he delivered the final painful blow. He told me he would be cutting off all contact until I came to my senses. I just thanked him for clarifying his choice, and I hung up the phone. It hurt, yes, but it hurt less than the betrayal. The true resolution came from Chloe. She came to the house a week later. She sat in the library and told me that her parents were furious at her for confirming the truth to Arthur. She told me they had called her disloyal and ungrateful. But she stood tall. She said that seeing me fight back, seeing me use my wisdom and not just my anger, taught her more about integrity than any class she had taken. She told me she was deeply sorry for their actions, and she promised me that when she graduated, I would be the guest of honor, and her parents would have to sit at the back. That quiet, unwavering declaration from my granddaughter was my true victory. It was the realization that the legacy I fought for was not the house, but the values I instilled, and Chloe had inherited the best of them. Now, 6 months have passed. The house remains a symbol of my independence, but not a prison. After the dust settled, I sold the property to the newly established Sterling Historical Trust, the foundation I had created, at a fair market price. I am now the trust's beneficiary, which means the house's value is preserved. Edward's memory is honored, and I have a significant, unassailable, liquid fund in my own name. The trust allows me to rent the house from the foundation for a nominal fee or sell it back to them at any time, giving me total freedom. The biggest twist, the final private joke between Edward and me, is this. I don't host Christmas here anymore. The memory of the betrayal is too sharp. Instead, I use my new freedom and cash flow to travel the world. I spent last Christmas in Iceland watching the Northern Lights. I am 75 years old, and I am finally truly free. I am proving that being old is not an invitation for others to take over your life. It is the time you finally get to live on your own terms. Ethan and Olivia, they are still living in their smaller house. the Christmas hub they worked so hard to establish, now tainted by the scandal of their greed. Their social standing is severely damaged, and they have lost the vast majority of their inheritance. I hear through my other children that they blame me still for being vindictive. They don't understand that I wasn't being vindictive. I was practicing self-respect. I was teaching them a lesson about dignity, a lesson they were too arrogant to learn naturally. My story isn't just about fighting back. It's about redefining what aging means. It means having the time, the wisdom, and the resources to stand up for yourself when others try to diminish you. It means knowing that the memories you collect are more valuable than the money you possess, and that a sharp mind is the strongest asset you can ever own. Don't ever let anyone tell you that your age makes you confused or weak. Your decades of experience make you the most formidable person in the room. If this story resonated with the seasoned strength you find in your own life, I would be honored if you subscribed. Let me know you're on this journey with me, and tell me, in the comments below, from what city are you watching this? Every grandmother has a story that needs to be told, and I'd love to hear yours. Thank you for listening to mine.